What did I have an encounter with? It was a typical day and I decided to take a nap in the afternoon. I lay down on my bed and my loyal companion Tara lay on the floor next to me. Suddenly I noticed a strange phenomenon. There was a sphere-shaped flying cloud with a diameter of around 30 centimeters floating through the air. It came in through the door and disappeared into the wall. The cloud was moving at a slow but precise speed, and I couldn't help but watch it in awe. Initially, I thought I might just be hallucinating, because it seemed like such a surreal experience. However, Tara also noticed the strange object, and got up to stare at it with me, indicating that it was real. I didn't feel scared or anything negative. I was just curious and intrigued by what was happening. As I lay down to take my nap, I kept an eye out for the mysterious sphere for it to reappear. However, after a few minutes, I didn't see it again. I eventually fell asleep, pondering the strange event that had just occurred. What was that whistle? When I was just a young lad of around 9 years old, I started experiencing incredibly strange and disturbing phenomenon that would occur during the night. Every single night, I would hear this ear-piercing whistle that would start off faint and distant, but then gradually get closer and closer until it was right next to my ear. The sound was so annoying and unbearable that I couldn't help but cover my ears with my blankets, hoping that it would somehow muffle the sound. Despite my desperate attempts to block out the sound, I still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. One morning after another sleepless night of dealing with the incessant whistle, I decided to ask my family if they had been hearing it too, and to my surprise, everyone denied hearing anything out of the ordinary. I was baffled and confused. Was I the only one who could hear it? This strange occurrence continued to happen for 2 weeks straight. Each night I'd be jolted awake by the obnoxious sound, and each morning my family would act like nothing was out of the ordinary. It was like I was living in a different reality altogether. One fateful night, however, I finally reached my breaking point. The whistle was louder and grating more than ever before, and I simply couldn't take it anymore, so I summoned up all the courage I had and got out of bed. I walked over to my bedroom window and slowly opened it, all the while bracing myself for what I might find. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. No source of the whistle, no shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. It was just me, my window, and the stillness of the night. As I stood there taking it all in, the whistle slowly faded away until it was no more. From that night on, I never heard that sound again. I still don't have any answers for what it could have been or where it came from, but I do know one thing for certain. That experience will always stay with me, haunting me with its eerie mystery. Unexplained light flash. A few years ago, I had a strange experience with my sister that I'll never forget. We were both lying in bed, scrolling through our phones, when we saw something that we couldn't explain. It was a flash of light, almost like a camera flash, that came from one side of the room. At first, we both ignored it, hoping that it was just one of us accidentally taking a Snapchat selfie with the wrong camera. But as the seconds ticked by, we couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, we talked about what had happened. The flash had come from where the bedroom door was, but the door was shut. It was close to the ceiling, and there were no outlets or windows in that area. The blinds were shut on the opposite side of the room, so there was no chance that it was headlights of a passing car. I had seen car headlights in that room before, but this was very different. It was just like a camera flash, and it lit up the room for a split second. It was unexplainable. A few nights later, my sister and I were discussing the flash again before we went to bed. As we were laying there, both wide awake on our phones, we saw it again. And this time, we didn't say anything. We just grabbed each other, pulled the blankets over our heads, and called our dad to come check it out. When he arrived, We explained what had just been happening, and we were both scared and didn't know what to do. My dad went over to the area where the flash had come from and looked around. But there was no explanation. Nothing that could have caused the flash. It was as if it had come from nowhere. After that night, my sister and I were too scared to sleep in that room again. We started sleeping in the guest room down the hall, where we felt safer. But even now, years later, we still talk about the strange experience. We still can't explain what happened. We probably never will. It's a mystery that will always remain unsolved. Mimics can fuck right off. On summer, my dad had taken me on a trip to repair the roof on one of the buildings on our property. Unfortunately, I was going through a rough patch with my health and was mostly confined to the house, crocheting and watching horror movies to pass the time. On a particularly windy day, the gusts were so strong that they rattled the windows and created an uproar of noise. It was undoubtedly not the best time to be up on the roof, so my dad had promised to take a break from roofing and do some yard work instead. Bored with my crocheting and tired of watching scary movies, I turned off the television and focused on my crochet work. It wasn't until after lunchtime that my dad had returned to the house, mentioning that he's going to go relax in the hammock and read for a bit. Suddenly, I heard my dad scream my name in a terrified tone, with his unique accent adding to the fright. As my name is Vanessa, it was evident that he had called out my name, and I immediately worried that he had fallen off the roof, or worse, somehow he was in danger. So I ran as fast as I could toward the back of the house where I had collided with him. He was out of breath and I had a terrified look. So did he. I was worried sick and asked him what was wrong. He told me that he had heard me screaming in fear, as if I was in danger or hurt. It was perplexing because at the same moment we both heard each other's voices scream our names. Now this may seem odd, but I call my dad Daddy, which doesn't sound anything like Vanessa. We were both equally terrified, and we couldn't understand how this could happen. For weeks we tried to explain the occurrence, the rattling noises and the creaking doors, and listening to the tree branches when it's windy, but nothing came close. Although we had experienced spooky happenings on our property before, this was different because of the mimicry of our voices. We couldn't explain what had just happened, whether it was a ghost, a demon, or just a prankster. What was its purpose? And what was it trying to achieve? Nevertheless, we always check out any weird stuff on our property, and never let this instance of mimicry lead us to believe that it's a trick instead of an actual emergency. One STG thing is following me. As a 19-year-old female living in an older Texas town, I've had my fair share of strange experiences. Most of them began when I was 5 years old, so about 15 years ago, but things got worse when I got a little bit older. My family first moved to Texas for my dad, and he was doing work way back in the mid-2000s, and I didn't feel like I was being watched until we moved into a large house in a pretty damn good neighborhood. The house was gorgeous, with 2 stories, a pool, and a large backyard. My room was on the same side of the house as the rest of my family's. However, after my parents' divorce, I had to move rooms to make room for the younger kids. The room I was now in was the only bedroom on the opposite side of the house, with a media room on the same side. But I'd always hated going into that room. When I first walked in, I was immediately met with an overwhelming anxiety. I didn't understand why, but it felt like 100 pairs of eyes were all staring at me. I told my parents about it, but they thought it was just because the room was always dark. However, I was never afraid of the dark until I lived in that house. I avoided going into the room whenever I could, and I would always close all the doors when there were no people inside. I would especially make sure the doors were closed before I went to bed because I got a perfect view of the entrance to the media room from my room. Every time after I closed doors, I felt like I was running up the stairs super fast after turning the lights off, but way worse. I would occasionally feel the same sense of overwhelming anxiety when I was just near the room or lying in my room. There were 2 incidents that I vividly remember happening in that house that really made me realize that my family weren't the only ones there. The first major incident happened when I was about 9. My family was going to go on a movie marathon in the media room for that night, and I was excited because I didn't mind being in there if I wasn't alone. We had eaten a fun dinner, and since I was a good kid, I was basically offering to do the dishes while my family set up upstairs. I was getting ready to go upstairs to meet the rest of my family when out of nowhere the feeling came back. I was hit like with a wave, with that familiar, overwhelming anxiety. But it was way worse than normal. I started to throw up and I began to have a panic attack. I was crying, throwing up, and felt like I couldn't breathe. I was all alone in our kitchen, hovering over the sink, when I felt a hand on the back of my neck. I whipped around and saw an outline of something, but not a full figure. I violently threw up again, and I heard someone whisper in my ear. I don't actually remember all of what it said, but I do remember it mentioning God. I started to bawl, but I was able to breathe again. We are a religious family, which is why I began to bawl after it whispered. I was still sick, but I didn't feel like I was in danger or anything. My older sister later found me over the sink after I didn't meet the rest of them upstairs. She told me I had been almost maybe an hour since I had left, and they figured I'd just gotten distracted. I didn't tell any of my family about what happened, and they just thought I had a panic attack. The second incident happened around 4 years later when I was 13. It was really late at night, and I was ironically watching Supernatural. It was a school night, and I remember feeling anxious as I watched the clock. I didn't want to oversleep and be late for school, but I also didn't want to go to bed. You see, I had been experiencing some strange occurrences in my Texas home, and I was always on edge, waiting for the next incident. The incidents had started when I was just 5 years old, shortly after my family moved to Texas for my father's work. We moved into a beautiful 2-story house with a pool and a large backyard. My room was on the same side of the house as the rest of the family's, but that changed after my parents' divorce, and I moved to a different room to make room for my younger siblings. My new room was on the opposite side of the house, and there was a media room on the same side, which I avoided at all costs. The media room made me feel incredibly uneasy, but I already told you about all that. We've since moved out of that house, but I still have one unfortunate experience in our current home. We moved into a gated high-income community, and the new house is really nice, but I still feel uneasy, especially when I'm staying in the media room. The last major incident happened about a year ago on Christmas Day. I was visiting my dad, and I didn't have a room of my own, so I was staying in with my younger brother. My older sister and I were sleeping in the game room while visiting. We somehow got on the topic of the old house, and I ended up telling her everything that happened to me while we were there. She told me she felt like there was something in the house too, but nothing ever happened to her personally. She was never really there. She lived with her grandparents for school, but when she visited the side of the house that my room was on, it made her uncomfortable at that time. We finished talking, and she told me that I may be a clairvoyant, but I don't really believe in those kinds of abilities. Something in my house mimicking voices and whistles. As someone who lives in a 2-story house with just my feline companion, N, I never expected to encounter anything paranormal. In fact, when I first moved in roughly 2 months ago, the place seemed devoid of any creepy or haunted vibes, which was a pleasant surprise given my unusual fear of sleeping alone in the house. However, my comfortable and peaceful nights were interrupted roughly 3 weeks ago when I began hearing my own voice being mimicked back to me from other rooms or even downstairs. At first, I dismissed these incidences as just mere figments of my imagination, since they were so quiet, but things took a more serious turn when I heard a very clear, "Hey, buddy," coming from behind a closed door in another room, a room that was completely empty at the time. The same occurrence happened a couple of times in different parts of the house, which left me feeling spooked and uneasy. But things took a more sinister turn when the person taking care of N while I was away this weekend informed me that he heard his own whistle being mimicked back from him from downstairs one morning. He does a very specific whistle to call N, and he was understandably rattled by the experience. In fact, he grabbed his keys and left immediately after. As someone who has his fair share of paranormal experiences throughout my life, I never thought I'd have to deal with it alone. Now the prospect of returning home and being alone at night fills me with dread and fear. I'm at a loss on what to do. I'm not sure if anyone's had similar experiences that they can share with me. If anyone has any advice or tips on how to handle these strange happenings, I would be eternally grateful. For now, I just hope whatever's in my house will leave me and my beloved cat alone. Weird figure posing as my sister. Back when I was living in Virginia and was around 9 or 10 years old, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. It all started when my friend and I went into my sister's room to bother her, a common occurrence for us at the time. But something was off about the whole situation. As we entered the room, I noticed the person on the bed, whom I assumed was my sister, didn't look anything like her. I couldn't see her face, and the long black hair was coming from under the covers, almost like a character from The Ring. Despite the strange appearance, I asked if she was sleeping, and the figure shifted into position. I took it as a sign that she wanted to be left alone, so my friend and I headed downstairs to grab a snack. But as we walked into the kitchen, we were shocked to see my actual sister standing there. Confused, we asked her if she had just been upstairs, and she said she was just returning from taking her dog for a walk. She had no idea what we were talking about. Feeling unnerved, we rushed back upstairs to investigate, and we found something that chilled us to the bone. Under the covers, we found the head of a Bratz doll, but the doll had brown hair that was way too short to match the long black hair we had seen earlier. Additionally, the figure in the bed was much larger than the doll, so it didn't make any sense. What's even more unsettling is that every time I bring up this incident with my sister, she has no recollection of it at all. It's like it never happened, which only adds to the mystery and fear surrounding the experience. I've been trying to figure out if that was the only time that it happened, and the answer continues to elude me. It's something that I still think about from time to time and sends shivers down my spine. Interacted with deceased family members leading up to my grandmother's passing. 6 months ago, I flew up to my grandmother's house across the country. I had moved out 2 years prior, and her health had been steadily declining since. My grandmother was in her mid-70s at the time and had been placed into a home hospice care. I had purchased tickets to a concert an hour away from her house, figuring that I'd come to visit my child at home, spend a day or two with her, and then help cheer her up and go to my concert and fly home the next day. Upon arriving, I found that the place was a bit of a mess. My cat had been neglected, and the caretaker, a family friend of ours, was just kind of bumming around. I was a bit panicked, but it was all right. My grandmother was doing fine, giving her medical conditions. Not great, but she had just a good amount of fight in her. At least another 3 or 6 months or so, maybe. As the place was a mess, I decided to spend the night at my friend's house. We woke up the next morning and headed over to make my grandmother some lunch and hang out. As we walked in, the house was filled with smoke to the point where I was having trouble breathing and expected everyone inside and my cat and my grandmother and caretaker to be dead. Thank God they weren't. I called the fire department and they vented the smoke out and left. Turned out the caretaker started a pot of pasta the night before, fell asleep, and ignored it until we found it. The hospice nurse came for my grandmother and found out that she was not doing so good. Not surprising, given that she had just been inhaling smoke for the past 8 or 9 hours. She was a bit sleepy and delirious, and as expected, I guess. The nurse and my friend decided it was the best time for my grandmother to go home or to nursing care, since she couldn't be alone now, obviously. My grandmother was still coherent and agreed reluctantly. The night was the night of my concert, and she insisted that I go to my concert and have fun and not to worry about her. So I went to the concert and spent the night at my friend's place again. We went over again the next morning and found my grandmother knocked out, just sleeping peacefully. It was around 9 a.m., and as the day progressed, I could tell she had taken a turn for the worse, from coherent to sleepy to nonverbal. The nurses came by and gave her morphine every 4 hours, and it was just terrible. Every time I walk into her room, it got very cold, just near her doorway, extremely cold. The rest of the house and her room were fine, but the doorway was cold. I thought it was strange, but brushed it off until I felt like I was being watched. I didn't mention this to my friend, who had stayed with me essentially this whole weekend, now considering the situation going on, but he brought up that he felt that way too. That's when I told him I felt it. I awkwardly, sort of jokingly brought up that I'd heard about this phone app called GhostTube. Whether it's being legitimately trusted or not, whatever. I said, obviously, I know it sounds stupid, but fuck it, morbid curiosity, you know? So we opened it up, just kind of hanging in my room, when I had a bright LED strip light up on the sound detection mode, and I asked some basic questions again. Not expecting anything like, is anybody here with us? Basic childhood like ghost, hunting stuff. Nothing, no response whatsoever. So I told my friend that I was going to check out my grandmother, and as I headed toward the door, the GhostTube app suddenly picked up a message. Don't go, or don't leave. My friend and I were both frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. A few seconds later, the app displayed no and stay here. We looked at each other visibly freaked out. The room felt colder than ever, and we both had goosebumps. Carefully responded to the app's messages by asking, "Who are you? And is this someone here with us?" The response I got back was Sailor, which was my grandmother's last name before she got married. Her deceased mother was also staying in my room for a year or two, so the fact that the app picked up on her maiden name was quite startling. At this point, I was freaking out. He was just kind of frozen. I was teary-eyed and continued asking questions. This went on for another half hour, with the app giving us genuine answers to our questions, albeit some a little bit vague. Never did we receive any simple yes or no answers, though. We also noticed that the LED lights in my room and the sound detection mode were flickering in response to our questions, even when there was no sound. So we repeated some of our questions and added, using the lights twice for yes and once for no. We asked questions like, "Are you here to help my grandmother reach the other side?" And all the answers we received were what you'd expect. This went on for about 4 or 5 hours, and I remember feeling a sense of relief and sadness at the same time. At one point, while my friend and I were discussing how insane this was, and we must have just been crazy, my friend suddenly went white. His eyes widened and he froze. I asked him what was going on, but he was too freaked out to respond immediately. Eventually, he reluctantly said, "I just saw a figure pass by the doorway." I was skeptical at first, but then I saw it too. It was tall and dark and seemed to move past the doorway and disappear. We both freaked out and we were about to leave the room when we suddenly heard my grandmother calling out my name. We quickly ran to her side and found her semi-conscious. We tried to calm her down and make her comfortable, but we knew that her time was running out. After a while, the hospice nurse arrived to administer more morphine to my grandmother. My friend and I took this as a sign to leave and let my grandmother rest. And as we walked out of the room, the GhostTube app displayed one final message, "I love you." We both froze and looked at each other. It was clear to us that this was not just some random coincidence. We felt that we had truly connected with someone or something beyond the physical realm that day. As we left my grandmother's house that day, I felt a deep sense of loss, but also a newfound appreciation for life and the unknown. I realized that there's so much more to this world than what we can see or touch, and that maybe, just maybe, there's something beyond this life that we're not meant to fully understand. feel like I'm going crazy and I don't know what to do. Shadow Hat Man. It was a few nights ago when I experienced something that still sends shivers down my spine. I was driving home at around 8:30 p.m. with my furry friend, my dog, on my lap, and her head out the car window. I had just turned the corner in the parking lot of my condo, heading toward my parking spot, when I caught sight of a large shadow from the corner of my eye on my driver's side. My heart skipped a beat and I panicked, thinking I had almost hit someone. I quickly turned to look at the shadow, but to my surprise, there was nothing there. I was only driving about 10 miles an hour since I was in a parking lot. My dog didn't react at all. I was about to shrug it off when my driver's side blind spot sensor went off, indicating that something was there. I looked at my side mirror and saw a tall shadow figure with red glowing eyes, running after my car just like a human. I was horrified and I sped up, but the creature seemed to be keeping pace with me. The side sensor stayed on the entire time, and I could see the creature until I pulled into my parking spot. I was trembling with fear as I was pretty sure that I was going to die when I got out, but to my surprise, nothing was there. I walked over to the area where I first saw it, and there was nothing to be found. My dog never reacted, which made me wonder, maybe it was just my imagination. But the sensor was not my imagination, and I saw it out of the corner of my eye before the sensor went off. This wasn't the first encounter with the creature. I've had 2 other experiences that felt like and looked like the same thing, and both were sleep paralysis. I had heard of the Hat Man or shadow people before my sleep encounters, but found out about them and looking them up and stuff. I attributed my experiences to sleep paralysis, and at that time my now husband and I had just moved into the condo, and both times it happened is when he had left early for work and I was still asleep. In my dream state, I thought some man had broken in and he was going to attack me, and both times my husband had forgotten to lock the front door. I told him I was feeling paranoid and to please remember to lock the door, and after that I never really remember it happening again until now, which is about 3 years later, and I was awake. It feels like whatever it is, it's the same creature. It's hard to describe, but it feels malicious, like it wants to hurt me. It feels like I'm going crazy. I've been having dreams of it chasing me for years, and I somehow know that it's a man chasing me, but I never see him, and in my dreams I'm always running and hiding for my life. The strange thing is that I've been running in this recurring dream for as long as I can remember, and lately I feel like I'm being watched. And when I walk my dog at night, I swear I hear footsteps every time I turn around. Nothing. I'm constantly searching for similar experiences online, but I can't seem to find anything on shadow people chasing others. Do you think I'm just paranoid? Or has anyone else had similar experiences? I feel like I'm just going crazy and I don't know what to do. The Shadow Man has visited my bed twice that I know of. I've always been hesitant to speak about my 2 experiences that I've never been able to explain, nor do I really want to understand them. The first experience took place when I was in junior high school. I remember being sick one night and left an orange nightlight on by my bedside table. I fell asleep and started dreaming. In my dream, I found myself lying in bed at the top of a long driveway on a hill. I looked down between my feet, down the driveway to the road, and then into the forest on the other side. As I lay there, I noticed a section of the forest that was darker than the rest of the trees. All of my alarms went off in my head, and I stared at the dark spot, realizing that it was the size of a tall man. I never saw the man move, but in the blink of an eye, I realized that he was no longer, and it was just in the middle of the road. Then another blink, and he was at the start of the driveway with the road behind him. Still, it was all dark. I could only see him because he was darker than the surrounding trees. Every few seconds, he had moved closer, but again, I never saw him move. He just got larger and larger and closer until he's standing at the foot of my bed. In my dream, I was trying to scream, but I couldn't. Then it opened its eyes, and they were orange light reflecting out of his black face. Suddenly, I woke up only to see the shadow at the end of my bed with two orange glowing eyes. I screamed and swung my arms out, knocking the orange nightlight onto the floor and breaking it. The shadow was gone, but I was awakened to a whole night, and I never understood what happened. I told myself I hadn't seen him at the end of my bed, and that it was just the end of the dream still in my mind when I woke up. Fast forward 15 years later, I had moved into a new house, a 1920s bungalow with a lot of history. It felt like a good space to me, but on my third night or so there, I was sound asleep when in my dreams, I started to feel terrified. I don't even remember what the dream was, but I knew that I was in terrible danger. And suddenly in my dream, my best friend from high school, who had died our senior year, was screaming at me, "You have to wake up, you have to wake up." My eyes flew open, and there it was again, the shadow man leaning over my bed. Pitch blackness except for two dark, oily, wet spots, like obsidian where the eyes should be. I snarled, "Get the fuck away from me," and without me seeing it move, it was just a few feet back, then a few feet more, then at the end of my bed, at the bedroom wall and gone. I never saw it move, only registered movements like you would under a strobe light. First here, then there, and then there, but no visuals of actual movement. At the wall, it seemed to fold itself and then was gone. That was in 1992, and I've never seen it again. One time a few years ago, my dog woke growling, and I woke to the feeling of maybe it being in the house. But down the hall, I told it to leave, and the feelings disappeared, and I fell right back asleep. I've never sought to find more about what happened. The rational side of me just wanted to pretend it was a dream, but that same rational side of me also was seeing every flag up, and that I was in danger, and that I couldn't just ignore that such a thing was standing over my bed. It was a shadow figure with two dark, oily, wet spots where its eyes should be. As it turns out, the house was built in the 1920s and had a long history of mysterious deaths and strange happenings. There had been several reported sightings of ghosts and other supernatural entities throughout the years. Some people even claimed that the house was built on top of an ancient burial ground, which could explain the strange occurrences. I was both fascinated and terrified by what I had discovered, and it seemed like there was some truth to the rumors about the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this shadow man was somehow connected to it. I decided to contact a psychic and see if they could shed any light on the situation. The psychic told me that the shadow man was a manifestation of negative energy that had been lingering in the house for many years. She said that the energy had attached itself to me because I was sensitive to paranormal activity. She also confirmed that my friend who had passed away was trying to protect me from the negative energy, which is why he had appeared in my dream. The psychic advised me to cleanse the house of negative energy and to protect myself with positive energy. She gave me several tips on how to do this, including burning sage and keeping positive energy crystals in the house. I followed her advice and performed a cleansing ritual in the house, and since then, I've never experienced anything or any other strange experiences, and I feel much more at peace. Looking back on the experience, I realized that it was a turning point in my life. It opened up my eyes to the existence of the supernatural and made me more aware of the energy that surrounds us. I'll never forget the shadow man and the terror that he brought into my life, but I am grateful for the lessons that I learned from the experience. RagingSharkK, my precognition story and further experiences with him. Hi, I'm Jane, and let me tell you about my strange but incredible experience with the late RagingSharkK. I've been a lover of music for as long as I can remember, and I've always had a special place in my heart for the classics of the 60s throughout the 80s. I'm only 17, but my love for this music is just as strong as any other fans. It was the night before my 14th birthday when something inexplicable happened. I was getting ready to go to a friend's house for an early celebration, and I wanted to put on some music to lighten the mood. I picked up my car CD, which I had barely listened to before, but I felt the most horrible gut feeling. It was as if something deep inside me was telling me that something was very wrong. I looked back at the CD and saw Rick Ocasek's picture. Suddenly, I knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die. I tried to shrug it off and not say anything to my mom, but the feeling struck me. And later that night, I put on Steve Miller instead to take my mind off of what had just happened. A few hours after, I got into my friend's house and I got the news. Rick Ocasek had just died. I couldn't believe it. I barely knew anything about him, yet I was both crushed and shocked that I learned this before the world knew and didn't tell anybody about it. Since that day, Rick has shown up in my dreams from time to time, usually with a bright purple aura around him. It's the color I've come to associate with him and his presence. We don't talk much in these dreams, but we do share time together before I wake up. It's as if he's just there to hang out with me. But Rick doesn't just visit me in my dreams. When I'm awake, he lets me know he's there by knocking over a book of his lyrics and poems that I keep on my desk. It's a little unsettling at first, but I've come to accept it as just his way of saying hello. For the past 2 years, on the anniversary of his death, I started a little ritual. I light a purple candle and talk and spin records with him using an opalite pendulum. I set some records on the floor and he chooses what music he wants to hear by swinging the pendulum. It's always an amazing experience and he's quite insistent with his decisions. He makes pretty great musical choices too. Sometimes I think to myself, why would Rick Ocasek hang out with a 17-year-old from Wisconsin that never even knew him? But I'm glad to have him around. It's like we have some sort of cosmic connection that goes beyond time and space. I still can't explain why I had that gut feeling that fateful night, but I'm grateful for it. It led me to discover Rick Ocasek's music and connect with him in ways I never thought possible. I may never fully understand what's going on, but I'm happy to have him as a friend, even if it's just in the spiritual realm. My deceased dog may still be around. It was a few days after my Labrador passed away, and I had just come back home on Tuesday, April 4th. I was sleeping soundly until I was awoken by a distinct sound that seemed like a cry. Initially, I was irritated at being disturbed from my sleep, but my anxiety started to rise as I tried to go back. I couldn't shake off the thought of what could have made such a noise at 3 a.m. Despite my unease, I eventually fell back to sleep. The following day, nothing noteworthy happened, and I went about my day as usual. However, on Thursday, April 7th, something strange occurred. I was in the middle of a conversation with my mom about something unrelated to our dogs. When we suddenly stopped talking, my mom looked frightened, and that's when I realized. I had heard a distinct sound, and I'd heard this before. It was the same cry I heard a few days earlier. I felt myself shaking as I asked my mom if she heard it too. She responded in the affirmative, confirming that we both heard a muffled cry sound. It was around 2 a.m. and we immediately checked on our other family members to see if any of them had made that sound. However, everyone was either asleep or doing nothing out of the ordinary. My oldest sister, who usually laughs a lot, said she hadn't laughed the whole night. We were all puzzled and couldn't figure out what was happening. After this strange occurrence, I went back to bed and didn't experience anything else that night. It's hard to say what was causing these sounds. Maybe it was all in our heads because we were all struggling with our beloved one's dog recently dying. And we wished that maybe we could have done things differently. It's also possible that it was an animal since we lived, far from the city. However, the fact that both my mom and I heard the same cry on 2 separate occasions makes me wonder if it could have been something else entirely. Looking back at it now, it all makes sense. The first cry sound I heard that woke me up was likely from my Labrador who was in the next room when he passed away on March 31st. As for the second cry sound my mom and I heard, I can't be sure, but what I do know is that it was a unique sound and we'd never heard it before. It's comforting to think that it might be one of our dog's way of saying goodbye, and it's assuring that he's in peace now. Something was running behind my car. As I drove home last night going around 55 miles an hour, I suddenly noticed something human-shaped running behind my car. There were no other vehicles on the road, and it was a rural area. I usually check my rearview mirror this late at night because deer are known to dart out of nowhere. But this time, I was looking at something that was not a deer. It was a strange, unknown entity that was following me for nearly 5 minutes. I kept glancing back at it, trying to figure out what it was. I couldn't get a clear look at it, but it was definitely humanoid in shape. Living in the Midwestern Great Lake area, I was familiar with stories of creepy urban legends and such, but I'd never experienced anything like this before in my life. I could feel my heart beating faster as I tried to come up with a rational explanation for what I was seeing, but there was none. As I approached a streetlight, I looked back once more, and to my surprise, the figure vanished into thin air. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I couldn't wait to get home and share this bizarre experience with anybody. I immediately called up my best friend and recounted the entire incident in vivid detail. She was equally freaked out, and we spent the next hour scouring the internet for any explanation or similar account. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that night. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me or something supernatural. But one thing's for sure, that experience left a lasting impression on me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. The Summer Camp Encounter. I remember this one summer when I went out on Boy Scout campout in North Wisconsin, in this well-known campsite with the smiling tent as a mascot. There were about a dozen of us, along with some scout leaders, all in the clearing where one of the many troops were set up. My best friend from childhood and I shared a tent, and it was maybe the third night when things started to get strange. I fell asleep normally that night, but I woke up to some strange sounds in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3. It was hard breathing or soft grunting, and it was really unnerving. I looked around the tent and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed my friend was awake too, and we both froze in fear. I gestured for him to be quiet and listened as something started brushing up against our side of the tent, poking into the fabric like antlers. Suddenly, something sharp and black poked through the tent, and we heard a loud exhale. Whatever it was, it stepped back, and we heard branches crunching and twigs snapping as it faded into the distance. We stayed awake for another hour, whispering to each other and trying to rationalize what had just happened. We wondered if we should check outside the tent, but we were too scared. When we woke up in the morning, we found 3 to 4 more holes in the tent, similar to the first one. We checked around the tent to see if we can find any evidence of what had happened behind our tent, and we found bare human footprints that circled around the tent several times. They didn't lead to or from the tent, but just made 3 or 4 rings that looped around. My friend and I were both really freaked out by the whole experience, and we talked about it a few times on the trip, but we haven't spoken about it since. It's been a few summers now, and the details are starting to get a bit fuzzy, but I'll never forget that strange night in the woods. What just happened? As I lay in bed next to my young son, my mind is wandering aimlessly when I suddenly saw a trip in my vision. It was like someone was unzipping a part of my reality, just to the left of where my eyes were focusing in the room. And to my shock, a young woman had torn through into my reality and was staring at me intently. It was as if she had opened a bag to see what was inside. I could sense that in her reality, she was walking on a busy street in broad daylight. I felt like she was just curious to see into someone else's life, without any malicious intent. She didn't say anything, she just stared at me with an intense gaze. I started to feel uneasy and asked her to go, and to my relief, she closed the rip and disappeared. I couldn't help but wonder if this was a common occurrence and whether people often looked into other people's realities. I was left with so many questions and had no explanation for what had just happened. It was such an unusual experience that left me feeling both bewildered and perplexed. I spent hours researching and looking for any similar experiences, but I came up empty-handed. As time went on, I tried to make sense of what I had witnessed, but still I had no explanation. I shared the story with a few close friends, but they couldn't offer any rational explanation either. Some suggestions that could be maybe lucid dreaming, while others believed it could have been a hallucination, but neither of these explanations seemed to fit what I'd experienced. And to this day, I still have no explanation for what happened that night. It remains one of the most inexplicable experiences of my life, leaving me to wonder if there are parallel realities that are somehow able to tap into. While it may seem like a far-fetched idea, I can't help but believe that there's something more to this world than what meets the eye. My paranormal encounter. In 2014, I was living in an area near Gainesville, Florida. One normal evening, my older brother and I were playing Call of Duty Black Ops on my Xbox 360. After we finished, we had to clean up the house and turn off all the lights before we were allowed to go to sleep. While doing the nightly chores, I noticed that the Xbox had been turned on by itself, which was very weird because I clearly remembered turning it off. I wasn't too alarmed, so I simply powered it off again and crawled into the lower bunk of me and my brother's bunk bed. As I was laying in the bunk, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched intensely. It was keeping me up, and it only seemed to intensify more as I tried to ignore it. Then it happened. I heard my Xbox 360 power on again, and it instantly threw me off because all of the remote controls were on the TV stand. And the only way it would power on is if the heat signature was right in front of the power button. I was startled by this, so I waited for a while. But I eventually got up and turned it off again, and as I crawled back into my bed and got comfortable again, I was greeted with chills running back up my back as I head back and the Xbox powered back on again. At this point, I was both scared and frustrated. However, this time, before I could even act, I was greeted by a bright flash of light in my face, like someone took a picture of me with the flash on. It was sudden and silent, and it was just like that, a flash, and before I could react, my room was refilled with darkness. The next thing I heard was my older brother asking, "Did you see that?" I could hear the concern in his voice. As soon as I responded with the concerned "yeah," a second flash happened, except this time the origin of the flash seemed higher up, like it was oriented toward my brother's part of the bed, and after this, my brother and I went silent and watched in confusion and unease as the flash reappeared in different parts of the house. Based on how the light would reflect off the walls, he couldn't tell where it was. It was going on in all rooms of our house, flashing multiple times in every room and slowly making its way down the hallway. Eventually, it made its way into our kitchen, and at this point, my brother and I got out of bed and we were watching the flashes happen in the living room. Then we watched as the kitchen lights turned on and off, except this time, rather than a flash, it seemed as if the light switch was being flipped repeatedly. After about 3 minutes, my brother mustered up the courage, grabbed a pocket knife, and headed out of our room and went into the kitchen to check it out. The light switch stopped flickering, and the incident was over. To this day, this is one of the weirdest incidents that I've ever experienced. I'd like to know if anybody has any opinion, or if anyone has experienced or read about something similar. My dead grandmother comforted me when my appendix ruptured and made me call the EA. Now I'm a seer. As an atheist, I never really believed in the existence of the supernatural or the afterlife in general. However, my experience in October last year made me question everything I'd ever believed in. For 2 weeks, I'd been dealing with intense abdominal pain, which only worsened with each passing day. I went to the emergency room 3 times, but each time I was sent back with painkillers and told to come back if the inflammation worsened. I couldn't hold food anymore, and I hadn't slept properly for 2 weeks. And with the most excruciating pain I'd ever felt, I even had a fever and vomited, and I was drinking water, and it was almost impossible. And despite all this, I still didn't go back to the hospital because the waiting time was about 7 hours, and I couldn't afford to waste that much time when I had work to do. At the end of the second week, I woke up in complete shock because my body was twitching and the pain was so severe that I vomited immediately after waking up. That's when I heard a voice and looked at the end of my bed. There I saw my grandmother, who was the one who raised me and loved me more than anyone else in my family. I adored that woman so much, but I was in complete shock because I didn't recognize her at first. Her voice was much younger and her face much more youthful, and her hair curly brown instead of that whitened strands that I used to know. I couldn't see what she was wearing because she was almost so white that she appeared like she was on fire or surrounded by light beams. She walked towards me and the only thing I could say was, "I love you, Omi." She didn't reciprocate, but she looked incredibly sad and asked me to call somebody for help. I told her that I did, and they sent me back numerous times. It was to no avail. They wouldn't help me. She interrupted me saying, "You need to go because you're dying, and I don't want to see that. You can't go just yet, not so young. Call for help." I replied. The pain lessened. I can sleep it away. My voice getting quieter, my body becoming very tired. I was so exhausted like never before, and I wanted to sleep, but for the first time I've known her, she got seriously angry. "You need to call somebody to help you. Don't go to sleep. Don't sleep now. I love you, but you must go now. Go, hurry." My body jolted up with force I'd never felt. I called the emergency services to come and get me. My voice became slurred, and while they weren't really talking to me in the hospital, which was only 9 minutes away, I already fainted and was in and out of consciousness. I woke up on the operation table a second before they applied the mask, and then faded away. The operation took about 6 hours to fix everything up. My appendix had ruptured and poisoned me, and my body was slowly succumbing to sepsis. If it hadn't been for the amazing doctors who saved my life, I would have died. The reason my body started to feel less pain that night my appendix ruptured was that the pus finally had opened and started to release, and the buildup of inflammation was gone. However, my body was dying slowly to sepsis. If I hadn't called the emergency services, I wouldn't have made it. When I told everyone in the hospital about my experience, they all believed me. Apparently, it's not unusual for dying patients to have visitors or visitors to take them with them to the afterlife. I never believed in such stories until I experienced it myself. After all this happened, I started having mad astral projections when I lay in bed. I began to see after my near-death experience something strange started happening too. I began to see things that I'd never seen before. I would lay in bed and have these projections, and things that would usually be invisible to me were there. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, allowing me to see beyond what's normally perceivable by humans. At first I was scared and confused by these visions. I didn't know what to make of them or what they meant, but as time went on, I began to realize that they were becoming more and more realistic. I would hear whispers in specific locations and my dreams completely changed. They were no longer filled with monsters or unrealistic beings, but instead, they were almost like visions of real-life events that would come true. I would share some of these visions with my boyfriend, who happens to be a physicist. He was fascinated by them. I began to theorize that my near-death experience might have changed something within my brain's neurons, allowing me to perceive things beyond what's normally possible. But while my boyfriend was intrigued with my newfound abilities, others were not so accepting. When I shared my vision with my friends, they were terrified and they didn't want to hear about it at all. They would tell me not to tell them what I dreamt of, and they just wanted normal conversation instead. I felt horrible because at first I was excited when something I saw would come true, but now it's causing fear and anxiety in people around me. For example, I prophesied that my best friend's husband would cheat on her and never come back, and he did. And he came back for 2 weeks and acted like he loved her before leaving her and filing for divorce. My friend was understandably angry with me, and it stained our relationship. However, I was also having visions that saved lives. I saw my mother's face completely disfigured in my dream, and she was in tremendous pain. I called her in the morning and asked her to go see the doctor. They found a huge abscess hidden in her lower jaw. If it hadn't been for that call, the infection could have traveled up to her brain or bloodstream, potentially causing death. As time went on, I began to wonder if there was a way to turn off these strange visions. I didn't ask for them. and they were causing more harm than good. I just wanted my life to be back the way it was before. But as far as I knew, there was no way to deactivate them. I was stuck with these abilities, and they were changing my life in ways that I couldn't have predicted. Golden Gate Bridge Ghost. This encounter happened about 1982. That's quite a while ago, but it's stuck in my memory as one of the first encounters I've had with a spirit. Luckily, they seem to appear as normal people to me. So, at the time, I'm not especially frightened. The place was under the North Pier of the Golden Gate Bridge. There's a parking lot and an incline that leads down under the North Tower. It's surrounded by granite blocks that are huge, probably 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall. They were cut as supports for the bridge as it was being built. They were never removed. When you're in your early 20s, it's a romantic place to walk. There's a very small lighthouse called the Fort Point Light that was decommissioned when the bridge was built. And as you can sit there and watch the fog roll down over the city, hear the foghorn blast from under the South Tower. I was dating a man who lived in San Francisco, and we were young and broke, so we went to the Ghirardelli chocolates, and then went for a walk under the North Tower to spend a little time alone, enjoy the sunset. It was almost sunset as we parked and walked down to the lighthouse. We sat on this little jetty next to it and talked until it was full dark, probably about 8:30, because it was either September or October. I don't know if you've been to San Francisco, but it gets very windy and cold as the sun goes down. We had only light jackets on. We decided to go back up to the car, head to the little coffee shop on 18th Avenue to warm up. As we got closer to the granite blocks, I noticed a man in a red flannel shirt and what looked like wool pants and work boots, sitting on top of a block, smoking a pipe. What sticks in my mind is the glow from his pipe and the smell of the tobacco that carried on the breeze. I nodded to him and said, "Hello." We were walking within about 5 feet of where he was sitting, and he said, "Hello, fine evening, isn't it?" I asked him if he needed a ride anywhere because the parking lot was empty, except for our car, and he answered very politely that he was waiting for his wife and daughter, but thank you. I asked if they were driving to meet him, and he laughed and said, "Oh no, he'd been there for quite a while, but he would see them walk up." Odd. At about this time, it registered on me that my date was jiggling. Literally, he was hopping from one foot to another, like he was in a windstorm, and he was tugging frantically on my jacket sleeve. He grabbed my elbow and pushed me in front of him to the parking lot, shoved me into the car. I was pretty irritated, couldn't figure out why his freaking problem was. It was bad enough that he hadn't said a word to a nice man, but he hadn't even let me say goodbye as we left. I turned to yell at him as he backed out and peeled out of the parking lot as fast as he could, but I was stopped by how pale he was. He looked as if he was about to cry. He didn't say a word until we got off the bridge and then started yelling. "Who were you talking to?" It turns out he didn't see the man. He didn't hear him either. He only smelled pipe smoke and saw me talking to a granite block. He said he felt freezing air and was afraid that if we didn't leave, something horrible was going to happen. He was afraid we'd disappear, were his exact words. Then I was a little freaked out and started doing some research on who this man might be. The Golden Gate Bridge was completed in 1938, and several workers were killed while building it. My guess is that he was one of the men who died during the construction, and his spirit was tied to the place. As for waiting for his wife and daughter, maybe they still lived in San Francisco, and he was waiting for them to pass. He would cross over at the same time. Doesn't sound like a bad place to wait to me. I never saw my date again after that night, but who can blame him? I was talking to a spirit. That would be enough for anyone to decide to find a girlfriend who didn't talk to people who weren't there. I've had a lot of encounters since then, but I'm grateful that he was sweet and polite. It taught me to stop and remember that mostly they're just people and not purposely trying to frighten you. Someone under the covers with me. We live in Texas City, and it's the site of a massive industrial accident that happened in 1947 that killed at least 576 people. The whole town was damaged, and one ship's anchor was blown 1.5 miles. The other landed at the base of the Texas City dike. That's about 4 blocks from my house. Most people were killed in offices, schools, neighborhoods, and the entire blocks from my house. Because of this, we've experienced what I think as people passing through. My theory is that my house, which is one of the few old ones remaining, is familiar to them. They never seem to mean any harm. There is also the earliest Air Force base in the nation here, and my house was right on the boundary line of where the base housing was. That might explain all the energy that seems to still come through from time to time. I fell off a ladder 12 years ago and fractured my pelvis and 2 vertebrae. When it really hurts, it helps to grab a comforter and sleep on the living room floor. It puts everything back into alignment, if that makes sense. One night last winter, I had slept on the floor, but woke up right as our antique mantel clock was chiming 4 a.m. I was lying on my side facing the TV, and the bedrooms and hallways were to my back. I heard footsteps and assumed that my husband woke up and came to check on me. I was sleepy and felt him lift the comforter behind me and climb underneath the covers and spoon me. Well, I thought he was being sweet and slightly romantic to keep me company. I Love Lucy was on, and I can tell you the episode. It was the one where Lucy meets Bill Holden. I'm quite sure that I was awake. I was looking at the clock the whole time. After a few minutes of spooning, I started thinking, gosh, his arm is so heavy, and I'm so hot. He was really throwing off some heat even though the room was cold. A gradual dawning happened on me that I hear snoring coming from the bedroom. My husband's distinctive snore and whistle. Who had their arm around me? I was too terrified to look. The arm around me was getting heavier and heavier, and I was panicking. In my mind, I decided to count to 3 and then jump and run for the bedroom. I counted it down and threw the comforter back and ran. I shook my husband awake, made him go and check the living room with me. There was no one there, but the comforter was rumpled as if someone had laid there, and the pillows showed indents for myself and whoever or whatever had been there. I still sleep in the living room once in a while, but I always sleep very close to the coffee table, where no one could possibly lay down behind me. Before I go to sleep, I say a little prayer that no one visits, and I ask out loud, please, I just want to sleep. Don't get too close or touch me. So far, so good. I know they mean no harm, but we already hear a group of people at 3 a.m., and a ghost dog bumps our bed pretty frequently. I love my house. I just don't want to be scared to death in it.